I never thought that a private security link would become the most terrifying thing I have ever clicked on in my entire life. It was exactly 12:42 in the morning when the notification pinged on my secondary work phone. I was sitting in my glass-walled office on the 22nd floor, surrounded by the eerie silence of a building that was supposed to be empty. My eyes were burning from staring at spreadsheets for 10 hours straight, and the only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning system. The email had no subject line, just a link to an unlisted YouTube livestream titled Maintenance Test 7. I assumed it was just the night security team testing the new motion-activated cameras they had installed on the 3rd floor earlier that week. I clicked the link without thinking twice, expecting to see a grainy, black and white shot of an empty hallway or a storage closet. The stream opened to a high-definition view of the 3rd floor lobby, which was strange because that floor had been closed for renovations for months. At first, the screen was completely still, showing the plastic sheets hanging over the doorways and the stacks of drywall leaning against the marble pillars. But then, the camera began to pan very slowly to the left, as if someone was manually controlling the tripod. I felt a small knot of unease form in my stomach because the security cameras in this building are fixed and do not have a swivel function. As the lens turned, it caught a glimpse of a reflection in one of the glass partitions. It was a person wearing a dark hoodie, holding a mobile stabilizer with a phone attached to it. They weren't a security guard. They didn't have a uniform or a badge, and they were moving with a predatory slowness that made my skin crawl. Why would someone be live streaming an empty floor in the middle of the night, and why was the link sent specifically to my private work email? I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart beginning to thud against my ribs like a trapped bird. The person on the screen stopped moving and stood perfectly still in front of the elevator bank. I watched as they reached out a gloved hand and pressed the button for the upward call. On my own floor, 20 stories above, I heard the distant, mechanical groan of the elevator cables waking up in the shaft. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. This wasn't a maintenance test at all. Someone was inside the building with me, and they were using this unlisted stream to broadcast their journey up to my office. I looked at the viewer count at the bottom of the screen. It said 1. I was the only person watching my own potential nightmare unfold in real time. I tried to tell myself it was a prank by one of the IT guys, but the way the person was breathing into the microphone, a heavy and wet sound, felt far too real for a joke. I stood up from my desk, my legs feeling like lead, and walked quietly to the heavy wooden door of my office. I locked it and turned the deadbolt, the metallic click sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. I went back to the computer, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the mouse. The elevator doors on the 3rd floor opened, and the hooded figure stepped inside, turning the camera around so it was facing the mirrored interior of the lift. They didn't press a button immediately. They just stood there, staring into the camera lens, hidden behind a cheap plastic mask that looked like a distorted human face. The silence of the stream was broken only by the hum of the elevator and that horrific, rhythmic breathing. Then, very slowly, the gloved finger moved toward the panel and pressed the button for the 22nd floor. My floor. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline dump into my bloodstream as I realized I was trapped in a glass box at the top of a skyscraper. The fire stairs were at the end of the long hallway, but to get to them, I would have to walk right past the elevator bank. If I left now, I might run directly into them as the doors opened. I looked around my office for anything I could use as a weapon, but all I had was a heavy glass award and a letter opener. I moved to the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest and sat on the floor, keeping the laptop in my lap so I could track their progress. The elevator display on the stream showed the numbers climbing. 7, 8, 9. Each beep of the elevator felt like a countdown to my own disappearance. Why weren't they stopping? Why did they have my email address? The questions raced through my mind, but the primary instinct was simply to survive. The live stream quality was incredibly sharp, and I could see the sweat beads on the person's neck despite the mask. They were excited. They were enjoying the fact that I was watching them. The elevator passed the 15th floor, and I realized I had less than 60 seconds before they reached my level. I knew that the heavy doors of the main office suite were programmed to lock at 10 p.m., but anyone with a master key or a stolen fob could bypass them in a heartbeat. I looked at the About section of the unlisted video, hoping for a clue, and saw a single sentence written in the description. It said, "You always stay too late, Sarah." My blood turned to ice. They knew my name. This wasn't a random intrusion. This was someone who had been watching my habits for a very long time, waiting for a night when the building was empty and the security guard was taking his usual nap in the basement. The elevator hit the 21st floor. I held my breath, pressing my hand over my mouth to stifle any sound, even though I knew they couldn't hear me through the screen. The ding of the elevator echoed through the hallway outside my office door. I heard the heavy sliding doors open. On the live stream, I saw the hooded figure step out into the familiar carpeted lobby of the 22nd floor. They turned the camera toward my office door at the end of the hall. I could see the light from my room spilling out from under the door on the screen, and then I saw the actual light shifting on the floor in front of me as they approached. They were walking slowly, dragging something metallic against the wall. It was a long, heavy crowbar. The sound of metal scraping against the drywall outside was perfectly synced with the audio on the stream. It was a dissonant, screeching sound that made my teeth ache. They stopped right outside my door. On the laptop screen, I saw the gloved hand reach out and grab the door handle. I heard the actual handle jiggle on my door, followed by a forceful shove. The lock held, but the wooden frame creaked under the pressure. Then, the person on the stream did something that made my heart stop. They held the camera up to the small glass viewing pane in the door and waved. I saw the wave on my laptop screen, and then I saw the dark shape of their hand through the actual glass of my door. They knew exactly where I was crouching. They leaned their head against the door and whispered into the microphone of their phone. "I know you're in the corner, Sarah. The reflection on your glasses gave you away." I looked at the laptop and realized the screen brightness was reflecting off my face. I quickly slammed the laptop shut, plunging the room into total darkness. Now the only sound was the heavy thudding of the crowbar hitting the door. Crack. The wood began to splinter. I knew I had seconds before the door gave way. I crawled toward the large windows that looked out over the city, my mind searching for an escape. There was no balcony, just a sheer drop, but I remembered that the window washing platform had been parked on this floor earlier that day for the quarterly cleaning. I scrambled to the far window and saw the heavy steel cables hanging just a few feet away. The door behind me shattered with a final, violent blow. I didn't look back. I grabbed the emergency glass breaker from the wall, smashed the window, and the freezing night air rushed into the room. I stepped out onto the narrow ledge, my heart screaming, and jumped onto the metal platform just as the hooded figure lunged into the office. I frantically searched for the controls of the platform and hit the down toggle. The winch groaned and the platform began to descend rapidly just as the person reached the broken window. I looked up and saw them staring down at me, the mask twisted into a silent snarl. They didn't follow me. They just stood there, watching me sink into the safety of the streetlights below. When I finally reached the ground and ran to the nearest police station, my hands were still shaking so hard I couldn't unlock my phone. The police searched the building, but the third floor was empty, and the person had vanished into the stairwell. The unlisted link was deleted 5 minutes after I escaped, and the account was deactivated. I never went back to that job, and I never work past sunset anymore, because I know that somewhere out there, that person still has the link to my life, and they are just waiting for the next time I'm alone in the dark. I wonder if you have ever checked your own unlisted links lately, or if you are sure that the person watching your screen is actually you. I used to think that technology was supposed to make us feel safer, but now I know it only provides more windows for the monsters to look through. It was a Tuesday night, around 2 in the morning, and the house was swallowed in that heavy, suffocating silence that only exists in the suburbs. My husband was away on a business trip, leaving me alone in our new, high-tech, smart home on the edge of the woods. I couldn't sleep, so I was scrolling through my phone when I noticed a strange notification in my email junk folder. It was a link to a YouTube live stream marked as unlisted with the title, Live Feed, Backyard Security Check. I felt a small prickle of confusion because I hadn't set up any public feeds for our cameras. I assumed maybe the security company was doing a remote diagnostic, but something felt off. I clicked the link, and my heart nearly stopped when the video loaded. It wasn't a view of the backyard at all. The camera was positioned in the corner of my living room, looking directly at the sofa where I was currently sitting. The quality was crystal clear, and I could see the glow of my phone reflecting off my face in the dark room. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat, staring at myself on the screen. There was a 2-second delay, so when I slowly lifted my hand to my mouth, I watched myself do it on the laptop screen a moment later. I wasn't alone. Someone had hacked into my internal home network and was broadcasting my every move to an unlisted corner of the internet. My eyes darted to the camera lens on the wall, and that's when I noticed the small, blue active light was flickering rhythmically, like a heartbeat. I scrambled off the sofa, moving into the kitchen where there were fewer windows, but the live stream followed me. The feed cut seamlessly to the kitchen camera, then the hallway camera, then the dining room. Whoever was doing this wasn't just watching a single feed. They had full control over the entire smart home interface. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized the unlisted part meant this was a private show, and I was the only performer. I reached for my phone to call the police, but as soon as I touched the screen, the house's built-in speakers crackled to life. A voice, distorted by a digital modulator, echoed through the empty rooms. "Don't call them yet, Maya. We're just getting to the best part of the stream." The voice was cold and mechanical, stripped of any human emotion, which somehow made it 1,000 times more terrifying. The power suddenly flickered and then died completely, plunging the house into total darkness. Usually, the backup generator would kick in within seconds, but tonight the silence remained. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, clutching a steak knife I had grabbed from the block, my ears ringing with the sound of my own pulse. I looked down at my phone, which was the only source of light left. The live stream was still running on my mobile data. The person holding the camera was now outside. I watched on the screen as a figure in a reflective vest walked up to my power box on the side of the house and began cutting the wires with methodical precision. They weren't a ghost or a glitch. They were a person, and they were standing less than 20 feet away from me in the dark. I backed away from the kitchen window, my mind racing through every possible exit. The front door had an electronic smart lock, which was now dead without power. The back sliding door was reinforced glass that required a key I couldn't find in the dark. I was trapped in a high-tech fortress that had suddenly turned into a cage. I looked at the live stream again, and the figure was no longer at the power box. They were walking toward the front porch. I heard the heavy thud of a boot stepping onto the wood, then another. Each step sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. I ran toward the stairs, tripping over a rug in the dark, my knees hitting the floor with a painful jar. I didn't scream. I knew that if I screamed, he would know exactly where I was. I crawled up the stairs, my eyes glued to the phone screen. The intruder reached the front door and stopped. On the live stream, I could see him holding a small electronic device up to the smart lock. "These digital locks are so much easier than the old ones." The voice boomed through my phone speakers. "One little bypass code, and the house welcomes me in like an old friend." I heard the mechanical clack of the deadbolt sliding open. The front door swung inward, and the cold night air rushed into the foyer. I reached the top of the stairs and scrambled into the nursery, which was the only room with a manual lock on the door. I slammed it shut and shoved a heavy wooden rocking chair under the handle. I sat on the floor, tucked into the corner behind the crib, watching the phone screen like it was a crystal ball showing my own death. I watched the intruder enter the living room. He was tall, dressed in dark work clothes, and he wasn't rushing. He was savoring the hunt. He walked over to the sofa where I had been sitting just minutes ago and picked up the book I had left behind. He flipped through the pages and then dropped it on the floor. Then, he looked directly into the living room camera and waved. "I can see your signal, Maya. I can see your phone is still connected to the stream. Why are you hiding? The viewers want to see the ending." I looked at the viewer count. It had jumped from 1 to 14. There were people watching this. There were people out there in the world, sitting in their warm beds, watching a live broadcast of a woman being hunted in her own home. The intruder began to climb the stairs. I could hear the wooden steps creaking under his weight. Each creak was followed by a long silence, as if he was stopping to listen for my breathing. He reached the landing. I watched the live stream as his shadow stretched across the hallway carpet, approaching the nursery door. He stopped right outside. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my hand gripping the knife so hard my knuckles were white. He didn't try to turn the handle immediately. Instead, he tapped on the wood with the back of his hand. "Top! Top! Top!" The sound was so casual, so friendly, it made my skin crawl off my bones. "The nursery is a good choice," he whispered through the door. "It's the most private room in the house." I knew I couldn't stay in that corner. If he broke through the door, I would be cornered like an animal. I looked at the window. It was a small hopper window, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it led out onto the roof of the garage. I climbed onto the changing table, my movements slow and shaky. I unlatched the window and pushed it open, the hinges screaming in the silence. Outside, the wind was howling through the trees, masked by the sound of the intruder now throwing his shoulder against the nursery door. The wood began to groan. The rocking chair was sliding back an inch at a time. I squeezed my upper body through the window, the cold air stinging my face. I heard the door frame finally give way with a violent splintering sound. I kicked my legs through the window and slid onto the shingles of the garage roof just as the nursery door burst open. I didn't look back to see his face. I scrambled down the slope of the roof, my fingernails tearing against the rough material, and dropped 10 feet onto the soft mulch of the garden below. I didn't stop to check for broken bones. I ran. I ran into the woods, the thorns tearing at my clothes and skin, until I reached the main road. A passing car saw me and pulled over, the driver's face pale with shock at the sight of me covered in blood and dirt. The police arrived 10 minutes later, but the house was empty. The front door was wide open, and the nursery was trashed, but the intruder was gone. They found the small hacking device still plugged into my router. The live stream had been cut the moment I jumped from the window. When they checked the unlisted link later, the video had been replaced with a static image of my own front door with the words, "See you soon," written across the screen. I never went back to that house. I live in an apartment now with old-fashioned metal deadbolts and no smart features at all. But sometimes when I'm scrolling through my phone late at night, I see a recommendation for a private live stream, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for me to click the link. The worst mistake I ever made was leaving my webcam covered by nothing but a thin piece of Scotch tape. I had been working on a video project for my film class, and I had set up an unlisted live stream link to test the latency of my new high-speed internet connection. It was 3 in the morning, and I was so exhausted that I simply collapsed onto my bed, leaving the laptop open on my desk with the stream still running. I didn't think anything of it. The link was unlisted, and I was the only person who had the URL, or so I thought. I drifted into a deep, heavy sleep, the kind of sleep where the world around you ceases to exist. But while I was dreaming, the viewer count on my laptop screen flickered from 0 to 1. I woke up suddenly at 4:15 in the morning, not because of a noise, but because of a feeling. It was that prickly, cold sensation on the back of your neck when you know someone is staring at you. The room was pitch black except for the pale, ghostly blue glow of my laptop screen across the room. I squinted my eyes, trying to clear the fog of sleep, and noticed that the live icon was still glowing red in the corner of the screen. I let out a frustrated sigh, thinking I had just wasted a massive amount of data, and I rolled out of bed to go shut it down. But as I sat down in my desk chair, I noticed the chat box on the side of the screen was scrolling. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. There were hundreds of messages. "He's waking up," one user wrote. "Look at his eyes, he has no idea," said another. I looked at the viewer count and felt my stomach drop into a cold abyss. There were over 300 people watching the stream. I looked at the video feed, expecting to see my own confused face, but the camera wasn't pointed at me anymore. Someone had remotely accessed my laptop's hardware and tilted the digital zoom toward the door of my bedroom. I watched the screen in a daze of terror as the door to my room, which I knew was closed and locked, slowly began to creak open on the live stream. I didn't hear the door move in real life. The silence in my actual room was absolute, which made the visual on the screen even more haunting. I looked over my shoulder at my physical door. It was still shut. I looked back at the screen. On the live stream, a tall, thin man in a gray tracksuit was standing in my doorway, holding a heavy kitchen knife. I realized then, with a jolt of pure electricity, that the stream had a significant delay. What I was seeing on the screen had already happened. The man had entered my room while I was still asleep. He was already inside the room with me, somewhere in the shadows where the laptop light couldn't reach. I sat perfectly still, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. I didn't want to move a single muscle because I knew that any sound would give away my exact position. I looked at the chat again. "He's looking for him under the bed," a user commented. I slowly lowered my gaze to the floor. The space between the bottom of my bed frame and the carpet was dark and narrow. I reached out a trembling hand and grabbed my heavy metal desk lamp, gripping the base like a club. I used the light of the laptop to scan the floor, but I couldn't see anything but dust and shadows. Then the chat box exploded with new messages. "He's behind the curtains," someone typed in all capital letters. "My bedroom has heavy, floor-to-ceiling blackout curtains that cover a large bay window." I looked toward them and saw a slight, almost imperceptible ripple in the fabric. The intruder wasn't under the bed. He was standing right next to me, hidden behind the velvet drapes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made my vision blur. I knew I couldn't run for the door because he was closer to it than I was. I looked back at the laptop screen one last time. The live stream showed the man stepping out from behind the curtain, his face covered by a white porcelain mask. He was looking directly at the back of my head on the screen. I didn't wait for him to move in real life. I swung the heavy metal lamp with everything I had, aiming it directly at the spot where the curtains were bulging. I heard a sickening thud as the base of the lamp connected with something solid. A man let out a sharp, guttural grunt of pain and tumbled out from behind the fabric, the kitchen knife clattering onto the hardwood floor. He was clutching his shoulder, his eyes wide and wild behind the holes of the mask. He hadn't expected me to be tracking him through the delayed stream. He hadn't expected the victim to be the one watching the hunter. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I lunged for the door, tearing it open and sprinting down the hallway toward the front of the house. I didn't grab my keys or my shoes. I just ran out into the cold night air, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. My neighbor, a retired police officer, heard me and came to the door with his service weapon drawn. We waited on his porch until the sirens filled the street, the red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of my quiet suburban home. The police found the tracksuit and the mask discarded in the backyard, but the man had climbed over the fence and vanished into the woods behind the property. When they checked my laptop, they found that the unlisted link had been shared on a dark web forum specifically dedicated to live home invasions. The users had been betting on how long it would take for me to wake up. The laptop was taken as evidence, and the technician told me that the intruder had installed a sophisticated mirroring software that allowed him to see exactly what I was seeing on my screen. I moved out of that house the following week. I live in a high-rise apartment now with 3 different locks on the door and no curtains on the windows. I don't use a laptop anymore, and I've painted over the cameras on my phone with thick, black epoxy. But every time I hear a floorboard creak, or every time I feel a draft in a room that should be sealed, I wonder if the stream is still running. I wonder if those 300 people are still out there, sitting in the dark, waiting for the camera to find me again.